Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name's Beth Cohen and today we're talking about the housing crisis. Catalonia has historically been a pioneer in promoting housing legislation, and it's the first and only region in Spain to apply a cap on rent. However, landlords are seeking out legal loopholes to avoid this cap, and rent prices continue to soar. In this week's episode of Filling the Sink, we'll be discussing the housing crisis, analysing the reasons behind rising prices, and finding out how tenants are fighting back. Joining me in the studio is Cillian Shields. Hello, Cillian.
Hey, Beth. How's it going?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. Excited about this topic. Dense, but important, I feel.
Yes, and very, very relevant. So, Cillian, can you explain how the housing situation has evolved in recent years?
Sure, yeah. So there's been a housing crisis going on in Barcelona and in Catalonia for quite a while now. To put it into a bit of context, in Barcelona, rent prices have been soaring for the past 10 years. In 2014, the average rent price stood at €668. And a decade later, it doubled to €1,132.
Ouch.
Yes, a lot of people are feeling the squeeze. Barcelona is also the most expensive city in Spain to rent a room in as well, at nearly €600 on average per month, according to the different real estate platforms. And the average price of rooms in Barcelona has actually gone up 49% in the past 3 years alone. And even more recently, Barcelona locals have been denouncing prices as high as €900 a month for just a 10 square metre co-living room.
That's ridiculous. I mean, I know that the situation in Barcelona is particularly bad, and I feel like local people are being priced out of their neighbourhoods.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. I mean, people all across the territory are really feeling the squeeze. And we've had amazing reporting from our colleagues over in the Catalan news agency, the Catalan language version of our company. They've done amazing work over the past couple of weeks looking into really in-depth reports on the housing crisis and spoken to people up and down Catalonia, from small towns to obviously in Barcelona as well. And we can really see from their reporting that this issue it takes various different guises. It looks very different in the different towns, but there's huge root problems that they all share.
And I think some of the solutions that people are finding are sharing accommodation, a single room in a shared apartment as opposed to having your own place. And also, I think we all know people who've moved back in with their parents as working adults, which is fairly gutting, in order to be able to save up to buy a house, or because they just can't keep up with the local prices.
Yeah, that's exactly the case, I think. And obviously, people don't want to move back with their parents. They don't want to share apartments with strangers. So it's obviously a lot of these people, they're not homeless, but they're not living in the conditions that they may want to, ideally. And it's just overall created a huge mass of just difficult conditions for people to live in. And in a lot of cases, impossible conditions to start a family project in, for example, in their hometown. So yeah, it's sort of a cycle of misery, even you could say, that's really been exacerbating over the past couple of years.
Yep, and for the tenants who do remain in Barcelona city centre, I think the conditions offered in rental contracts are becoming increasingly unfavourable. So to find out more about this, we actually spoke to some tenants to hear their side of the story.
Es una situación de angustia, de miedo.
This is Naufal Amrani. He's been going through a difficult period for more than a year now with his housing situation. Amrani says that he feels anxiety, fear and injustice, and points out that this is something that a lot of people in Barcelona are feeling. He says that people are left without protection and they'll accept whatever conditions landlords impose.
Yo, por ejemplo, estaba dispuesto a pagar lo que sea.
He explains to our colleagues in the Catalan news agency that once his contract was up, his landlords offered him a new deal, but with the rent increased by €250 a month, and on top of that, he was forced to pay €1,000 in agency fees, all just to stay in the home that he and his family had lived in for years.
Cuando me avisaron que no me quería renovar, 46 días antes.
His landlords notified him only 46 days before his contract was up that they were not going to renew it or offer an extension, and he says that this was not enough time to find a new place to live.
No era un tiempo realista para encontrar una alternativa.
Lawyers told him that the property owners can offer extensions, so therefore they offered him only 11 months. And when he went to sign it, only then did he realise that this was a different type of rental. But this was his only option, so he signed it.
¿Vale? Después de firmarlo, claro, yo como que no tenía otras opciones, era la única opción, lo firmé, porque quería un hogar, quería quedarme en mi casa.
After signing, lawyers told him that it was a fraudulent short-term contract, and by law, he had the right to renew his full rental contract for 5 years. He says landlords can avoid many of the requirements and price caps by offering short-term lets, and this leaves renters in a vulnerable, uncertain position that landlords can abuse, Amrani says.
Y pueden mantener al inquilino en una situación de inseguridad constante, por lo tanto pueden abusar de él cuando les da la gana.
On top of that, when looking at other options in his price range, he continually found 400 other people going for the same flat.
Y por cada piso que visitaba me encontraba con más de 400 candidatos.
In Gràcia, Carme is undergoing a different situation. An investment fund promoting what they term co-living bought up his entire building and started to evict tenants.
Nosaltres, els que hem estat visquent aquí els últims anys, teníem contractes al voltant de 700, 770.
Residents who had been in the building for some years had rents of between €700 and €770, but the new owners, New Amsterdam developers and Enter Co-Living, are dividing the flats by rooms and asking for up to €930 per room, measuring only around 10 square metres. Carme criticises that they call it co-living as a marketing strategy, instead of calling it as it is, sharing a flat with 3 strangers for €1,000 a month.
Li diuen co-living com a estratègia de màrqueting, però en realitat, per no dir-li, comparteix un pis amb 3 desconeguts per gairebé €1.000 al mes.
He says that these new owners are taking advantage of a gap in the law and engaging in fraud to triple their profits by speculating on housing, throwing people out of their house and filling the apartments with people who have a much higher purchasing power than the locals, all at the cost of changing the fabric of the neighbourhoods.
No? I a tota costa de canviar la configuració dels barris, dels edificis i de com entenem la ciutat.
Living like this is causing a lot of anxiety for Carme, and he feels that it has become normalised for renters to suffer with their housing situation.
El problema és que també jo crec que hem normalitzat patir.
You don't know if the owner will renew your contract, and if they do, they could increase the rent, he says.
I really feel for those tenants, and of course there are thousands of people in the same circumstances. So to combat the situation, earlier this year the Catalan government introduced the rent cap law, right? What is it, and why isn't it working?
Well, what is it? It's a rent cap law. It caps the rent on apartments that are for rent. This is regulation based on Spanish legislation that came into force in Catalonia in early 2024, and based on various different factors, it sort of sets minimum and maximum prices that apartments can be rented for. So the second quarter of this year was actually the first full quarter that happened with the regulation in effect. And so that's a good time to actually look at what happened there. Average rent prices in the municipalities where it is in effect actually decreased by 5% on average. But also importantly, the housing offer reduced by 17%. And experts are divided on what the long-term effects of such a law on the market is going to be. So you asked, is it working? It's a very multifaceted question that can be dissected and looked at in different ways. Like, yes, rent came down by an average of 5%, but then also we're seeing other unintended side effects which could be detrimental in the long term.
So, Cillian, is this law in place everywhere in Catalonia, or is it just in specific zones?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's only in effect in towns which are deemed tense housing zones, and it is actually in effect in areas of Catalonia covering where 90% of the population actually live. So the vast majority of Catalonia, but not all of it. It's also in effect in Barcelona, so it's in the big city here as well.
Okay, and what defines a tense housing zone?
Yeah, this is important as well. On many of our articles on Catalan News, you will see this phrase repeated a lot, and it's a very specific term that's part of the regulation. And what defines it? Well, a tense housing zone is an area where the cost of rent or mortgage, plus basic expenses, exceeds 30% of the average income, or towns where the price of housing has grown at least 3 percentage points higher than the growth of inflation in the past 5 years.
Okay, I mean, more than 30% of average income is, I think, really quite common. I know that we certainly destine a far higher percentage of our income than that on housing.
Yeah, and I think that's the most common thing all over Catalonia, really.
And is the problem a lack of housing?
To a large extent, yes. This is one of the biggest, most pertinent points in the housing crisis. If we take a look back at the construction of new homes over the past couple of decades, it has slowed down drastically. And the kind of big flashpoint in this story is the 2008 financial crash, which was all based in Spain, at least, and the Spanish economy was based around the construction bubble, which burst in 2008. So looking back in the 1990s, in the entire decade, the number of new homes that were built in Catalonia then was over 406,000 in the entire decade. This figure rose in the next decade, in the 2000s, up to 631,000. So that's more than 50% more. This is during the construction bubble, okay? When that bubble burst, the sector collapsed and only 88,000 houses and flats were completed in the 2010s. So a huge reduction. It's had a little bit of an upswing since, but nowhere near the levels that it was at before.
Okay, so it's bouncing back, but it seems like it's still got a long way to go. And do you think this recovery is due to population growth?
A little bit, but this is also another important factor to consider here. The construction bubble came at a time that Catalonia's population was increasing hugely before 2008, but while the number of residents has continued to rise at the same rate, the trend in the pace of construction has been inversely proportional since 2008. So the population is growing and growing and growing, but Catalonia has not been building houses for these people, which has left us in the situation today, which a lack of housing stock is causing a lot of stress on renters, on everybody.
Hence the high prices and the lack of availability. So there is demand, but there's not supply.
Yes, exactly. And according to construction promoters, it takes around 3 years on average for building permits to be obtained and then that building to be constructed before the residents can actually move in. This is a big problem for the sector. They want to see this time reduced any way that's possible, especially the bureaucratic parts that just waiting for permits, waiting for licenses. Indeed, a spokesperson for the real estate platform Pisos.com told the Catalan news agency in an interview that he predicts house prices to continue to rise for the next 2 or 3 years at least because of precisely this issue, because of a lack of housing stock. He calls the rental market dramatic and frustrating.
Yeah, so because of this dramatic and frustrating rental market, people are unhappy and they're starting to protest. So in fact, on the very same day that this podcast is being published, Saturday the 23rd of November, the Tenants Union has organised a protest in Barcelona to demand a reduction in rents.
Yes, that's exactly right. This is expected to be a fairly huge demonstration. They're demanding 50% general reduction in rents, and they're also using this demonstration to threaten a potential rent strike if such significant reductions in rents are not forthcoming.
Okay, and it's not just in Barcelona, it's all over Spain, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The idea of a rent strike was actually first announced in October after a protest in Madrid, where 22,000 people turned out. But indeed, these are just 2 protests that have been part of a wider series of housing demonstrations all across Spain in various cities up and down the country between October and even more scheduled for December.
So to find out more on the legal debate over the rent strike, we spoke to some of the people involved.
Carme Arcarazo, the spokesperson for the Tenants Union, says the November 23rd protest will not be the culmination of anything, but rather the starting off point.
És a dir, el que estem dient és que aquesta manifestació no és un final, sinó que és un principi.
This protest is not an end, it's a start. And from the 23rd, we're going to have to start organizing how we move forward with the rent strike. It's not something we've already decided. It will be a case of deciding among everyone who joins the process in the coming months.
Judit Esposa, a representative of a housing union in the Barcelona neighbourhood of Gràcia, believes a protest would shine a light on the issues that they want to bring attention to.
Generaria un canvi social.
A rent strike would create social change. It would shine a light on the horrible drama that so many of us are living today. Personally, I think it's feasible. I view it as the future, and I think it will be real.
A futura y la veig real.
She points the finger of blame at wider structures that together have left tenants in a more vulnerable position.
Però al final el que passa és que hi ha tot un sistema judicial.
The judicial system and the legal system all protect evictions. The issue isn't about whether or not the landlord is a bad person. They just want to make money, that's it. We're not asking them, like we're asking the housing minister, to be in solidarity with us. They will never be.
Solidaris amb nosaltres, no. Ells mai ho seran i sempre nosaltres com a sindicats mai pensarem que ho seran. El problema està en que
The problem is the judicial system, which is not there to protect people who are not landlords. And these are politicians who are making money from housing. The housing minister is making money from housing. They have more than one property.
d'un habitatge, no? Llavors,
So how would a rent strike work? What would it look like?
Podríem estar parlant d'autoreduccions, és a dir, de vagues parcials.
It could be a case of unilateral reductions, so paying only a part of the rent, or even a full rent strike, a general strike, a strike against specific companies. Everything is on the table. But one thing that's for sure is that for this strike to work, it has to be followed by a huge amount of people. We're not talking about something small. It has to be thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Milers i milers i milers de persones que la facin.
Jordi Bonsoms, a law professor at Pompeu Fabra University, hypothesizes some other forms a strike could take.
Avui en dia jo crec que tenim tots els ingredients perquè puguin haver-hi vagues de lloguers.
I think right now we have all the ingredients in place to potentially see a renter strike. But I think we would more easily see a renter strike that is an exercise in political action from a specific group of tenants, rather than a general strike with everyone participating. Well, in the end, everyone could join, but I think in the beginning, it would be in an apartment block against a specific owner, against an investment fund that is increasing the rent, or putting in abusive clauses, or harassing the tenants.
Jordi believes that there should be some legal mechanism to lower rents if tenants cover costs to improve the property, especially in cases where the owner neglects to do this.
Igual que un propietari pot augmentar el lloguer avui en dia amb la regulació de lloguers per fer una inversió en l'habitatge. No?
A landlord can legally increase the rent if they make significant investment in the property. Well, the reversal should also be the case. If an owner does not invest to solve serious issues that could potentially affect the health of the tenants, the tenant should have the right to fix these issues through their own investment and have the rent price reduced for a certain time.
En l'habitatge i, per tant, reduir-se el preu de lloguer durant un temps.
He cited the example of New York, saying that there, tenants can lower rents if owners are doing nothing about serious imperfections with the property. Meanwhile, Maridalia Rodriguez, an expert in property law, is not convinced that there's any legal basis for such a strike, and only sees it ending one way.
Una huelga de alquiler pues no tiene un respaldo legal y más que...
A rent strike doesn't have any legal standings, and more than a rent strike, we're looking at a vast call to defy contracts. This would of course create a judicial gridlock, but it would inevitably end in an avalanche of evictions.
Pero inevitablemente terminaría en una avalancha de desahucios.
Manager of the Barcelona Urban Property Chamber, Òscar Gorges, dismisses the idea of a rent strike outright and took aim at the Tenants Union.
Es pot negar a pagar el seu lloguer i...
Nobody can reject paying the rent, and if they do, they will face the consequences because the right to not pay the rent doesn't exist.
Home, jo he vist l'experiència diré...
I've seen from experience that you shouldn't give any importance to what the Tenants Union says. Since they've appeared and gotten involved in politics, we've gotten to a worse situation.
Anat proposant, doncs anem a pitjor.
For Xavier Vilajoana, the president of the Association of Construction Promoters, such a confrontation between renters and landlords seems absurd.
Sembla la cosa més absurda del món, perquè els vull recordar una cosa.
It seems like the most absurd thing in the world to me, because I'll tell you one thing, there are no renters if there are no landlords. A confrontation between the two sides is absurd because both sides make up the market. The two parts are as necessary for each other. Whether a strike has any legal basis or not, a judge will have to decide.
Si té encaix legal o no, això suposo que haurà de ser un jutge.
But their whole attitude seems very adolescent to me, with all due respect to adolescents.
Absolutament adolescents, amb tot el respecte als adolescents.
Thank you, Cillian, for bringing us that report. In fact, this isn't the first time that a rent strike's taken place in Barcelona. I believe that in 1931 there was a mass rent strike in the outskirts of the city. Do you know what the causes were? I mean, was it a similar situation to this current one?
Yeah, it was relatively similar, I think. We have to think back at the 1920s, 30s. Barcelona was one of the fastest growing cities in the world. There was huge immigration to the Catalan capital, mostly from rural parts of Spain, Extremadura, Andalusia. So, especially for construction jobs, mainly centered around the 1929 International Exposition, for example. This brought lots of people to Barcelona for various different jobs. But basically what happened was the city could not build enough houses to accommodate all of the workers coming to build much larger infrastructures for these kind of global events that were taking place in the city at the time. So what happened? Well, people were living on the outskirts of town in shanty towns, we would understand them as today, really, which all led to people getting sick of these squalid conditions and engaging in all sorts of strikes. But this rent strike of 1931 was one of the biggest. By its peak in August, over 100,000 people were taking part in it, and the strike lasted from around April to December.
And how did the 1931 rent strike end? Did the tenants manage to make their voices heard or not?
Well, yes and no, but probably more no than yes, to be honest. The strike and demonstrations that it attracted were aggressively suppressed. 18 people were killed by police. There were dozens of injuries and arrests. It ended also with the imprisonment of the whole committee organising it. Although in the aftermath, some tenants did actually manage to make agreements with small owners for a reduction in rent prices in some parts. So it was something.
Okay, so at least it did make a difference despite the sacrifice involved. And although we can make comparisons between the 1931 rent strike and the current situation, there are other factors behind the current crisis, such as pressure from tourism, for example. Cillian, how has tourist accommodation influenced rental agreements?
Massively. Tourism is one of the central nodes of this entire story, really. We even saw during the summer, it made headlines all over the world, this anti-tourism protest in Barcelona, where we saw some visitors even being sprayed by water guns. So tourism, obviously, it's central to this whole story. The Catalan administration have started to set up limits on tourist apartments. They've capped holiday flats at 10 per 100 inhabitants in municipalities deemed tense housing zones. And also the current mayor of Barcelona, Jaume Collboni, he's vowed to not renew the tourist apartment licenses and therefore get rid of all holiday rentals in the city by 2028.
Okay, so that would mean that tourists couldn't stay in apartments, they would have to stay in hotels.
Theoretically, yes, if this manages to happen. Whether or not it happens, we'll see. But the idea behind these measures targeting tourist apartments is to bring them back into the stock of houses available for people who live here. And indeed, all sides agree that it's also necessary to continue building more housing, to increase the rate of construction too.
Okay, and what about outside Barcelona?
Yes, this is very much a problem that is not just centred on the big city. It's happening all over Catalonia. North, south, coastal, mountains, inland, everywhere is feeling the effects in one way or another of tourism. Our colleagues at the Catalan news agency did some special reports in towns like Cadaqués and Sitges, in a couple of mountain towns as well. And there, the locals that they interviewed, they all said the similar things. They all said that they feel like they're being expelled from their hometowns. They're being priced out of renting as more and more property owners are looking to tourism instead of serving the locals. Our colleagues interviewed people from the Pirineu Biu, a housing platform of various different activists and unions which sprang up a few years ago, and they are calling for stronger regulation on holiday homes up there, as they have denounced some residences that are not people's second, but people's third or even fourth homes.
Okay, so given the situation, how are locals coping? Can they still get a roof over their heads?
Yes. And renting a room in a shared flat is becoming the only viable option for more and more people who can't afford an entire apartment. There has been a big increase in demand, and this has caused prices for rooms in shared flats in Barcelona to increase by 49% in the past 3 years. So from around €400 to rent a room on average in 2021 to €600 now. And housing activists say that this is just another way that landlords are evading price regulation.
Okay, because of course the rent cap law doesn't apply to rooms within a shared apartment.
Yes, that and short-term lets are obviously the two major loopholes, which is causing people to go out and protest against the housing crisis.
Of course, because people don't want to have to share with strangers, they don't want to have to leave their area, and home, of course, should be a place for comfort and not a source of anxiety. Today we've been discussing the housing crisis in Barcelona and exploring the legal debate over the rent strike. Thank you to Catalan news reporter Cillian Shields for joining me and sharing your expertise.
Thanks very much for having me, Beth. I think it's a very important issue, and it's good to talk about it today.
Thank you to Naufal Amrani, to Chema, and to everyone who spoke with us about the rent strike. That's almost all we have time for today, but before we go, Cillian, What's our Catalan phrase of the week?
This week we've got comenzar la casa per la teulada.
To start the house with the roof. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, that's how you build a house, isn't it? You build a roof first and...
Well, I would start with the foundations personally, but call me old-fashioned.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense. That's basically the gist of it. It means to do things in the wrong order.
So in English, we would say to put the cart before the horse.
Precisely.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We'll be back again next Saturday with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.